Hi, my name is Aindri
And I'm Mahak.
and welcome to another episode of All About That Reef.
Today we'll be talking about sharks and rays
Rays.
and their fisheries. So Aindri, before we start off, do you want to tell us some fun facts about sharks?
I don't know that many fun facts, but I know that sharks are older than trees and that they've been here for a long, long time. And one shark species like the Greenland shark has been living for at least like 400 years. And just the fact that they still survive with all the destruction that's going on in the world when it comes to like shark fisheries is like mind-blowing to me. But yeah, like there are so many issues that come with this whole like topic, so I'm interested and want to know more about what the guest is going to tell us about this as well.
Yeah. I think, like you're saying, sharks are really ancient creatures. They've actually existed for about 400 million years, and like you said, before trees, they're actually 200 years, they predate dinosaurs by about 200 million years. So they've, I guess, existed for the longest time, and there is just so much diversity what encompasses sharks and rays. Like there's just like the amount of variety you get the Greenland shark, like you said, which is like super old, and each individual can live up to about 500 years. Then you get things like the bull sharks and the great whites, which you would see in like a lot of the movies and things like that. But then you also get tiny sharks, and there's just, and then I mean, we've not even started discussing rays, right? Manta rays, mobula rays, like devil rays. There's just so much to it, and like they're so resilient, but also just knowing, because they're apex predators, they actually are really slow growing species, which means that they have really slow life histories, and because of that they also reproduce very, very, like usually it'll be like one or two offspring over a number of years.
Yeah.
Which actually, while they are resilient and have existed for so many years, actually makes them so vulnerable, right, to fishing pressures and other threats as well. Like fishing is just one of it.
Yeah.
And like, I mean, bycatch, like shark finning, which used to exist like very heavily the last few, like a few decades earlier.
Yeah, and I guess we should dumb it down a bit for people that sharks and rays come under the category of elasmobranch, and that they are apex predators, so they are very high on the food chain. So which means that they control a lot of how the ocean works and the temperatures and the habitats and how other sharks, other fish are eaten in the ocean. So all of that matters, and I don't think there is that much of awareness of people knowing how important these species are and how they benefit our oceans as much as like any other species.
Yeah.
Of course, I have witnessed manta rays and sharks in like other countries, but I've never had the opportunity, or it would be very rare for me to see like a ray or a shark underwater, and that goes to show that like we literally wipe our seas out from finning, like fishing for these sharks and rays. And if you go to like a fish market, you will see the amount of sharks, like hammerheads, and I didn't even know hammerheads existed in this country until you see them at a fish market, which is the saddest thing ever.
Yeah.
Like I've never seen a manta ray in the sea, but I've seen it at a fish market, and that's so devastating for someone who's like always in the sea, and knowing that there are these like animals, like you will see these animals in the ocean, but not in our country.
Yeah, I think what you said, like you've seen it dead in the market but not in the ocean, is so true for so many Sri Lankans when you think of sharks and rays, right? And also, like you were saying, they're apex predators, and basically they do what is called like top-down control, where they actually engineer the ecosystems that they are found in, which means that when you start wiping out shark species, that you have trickle-down effects, and the entire ecosystem tends to collapse, because you would have like some of the lower fish in the chain like growing exponentially, which then eats the one that's one trophic level below. So things like, sea urchins and things start to take over and damage ecosystems. So like that really speaks to how important they are for the ecosystem as well, which I thought was like a really valid point. But to your point on like shark fisheries in Sri Lanka, it is really crazy. I remember like going to the Negombo fish market and being so overwhelmed because there was just like giant manta rays with their gill plates fished out, which was something that they use for traditional like Chinese medicine, which is supposedly has healing properties. And in the past they used to do what was called shark finning, which is where you would literally just take the top of the fin of the shark, because it was used in soup, and then you just throw the entire carcass of the shark back into the ocean. So I mean, I can't think of anything that's more wasteful than that, and just like a sad reason to sort of kill a shark.
And I've actually seen videos of them doing it, and like how the shark is actually drowning after it
because
loses
they
its
can't swim. And I mean, it still happens in this day and age. Just because the sort of trend has died down doesn't really mean that it isn't happening. And even with the shark fisheries, one of the reasons shark fisheries is so popular is because, like we were saying, because they were apex predators, they thought that, okay, if you reduce the number of sharks in the ocean, you'd actually have more fish because that means there are less sharks eating the fish. But they actually found out the opposite and realized that removing sharks is leading to collapses.
And it affects like ocean temperatures and all of that. So like it's not just like having enough fish in the ocean as well. And I think in Sri Lanka it's more of like a lack of awareness to understand what these species do. And also I think there were like traditions, like old traditions and cultural norms that people still believe in. Because we actually might have even eaten shark, because it's actually called mora in Sinhala. And they sell mora at fish markets, because obviously we see a lot of we see a lot of sharks in fishing markets. And so sometimes when they're not collected, they dry most of the fish that are not sold that day. They dry it at these fish markets, and they're sold as dried fish.
Karavala.
So also known as karavala. So we actually unknowingly are eating shark, and that I mean, the fact that I think that I've actually eaten shark is just
And I think what also happens is, like, we know that Sri Lanka has a high diversity in sharks and rays, right? I think we have 63 species of sharks and 42 species of rays. So in total we have about 105 species. And when you think shark, you're not thinking of all these different species. Like when you think you're eating moramalu, you don't actually have a visual image of what it is you're eating. So you don't actually sort of go back and think that you're eating shark. You're just eating,
because you don't actually see it.
You don't actually see it, but also you don't associate mora as shark, or you don't associate the image of the shark you have in your mind as the fish species that you see in the market, right? And then also I think, like you were saying, there are some old wives' tales that I've heard, that when you're the one who told me that apparently they used to be told that if you are about to breastfeed, you should eat the silky shark, right? Because it supposedly helps in generating milk or something like that, where there's no scientific backing to it.
But meaning that mothers who are breastfeeding should eat silky shark.
I mean, there's no scientific evidence to
Not
it,
at all.
but it just goes to show that something's also like built into like tales and customs, like you were saying, which in the end are to the detriment of these species. I was also I just remember we recently, on a visit to the fish market, there was also a lot of rays, like I was telling you, and they usually were sold for gill plates, which meant that there was lots of meat, right, that was left unavailable. So fishers started selling, after they cleaned the gill plate, they started selling the meat of the ray, and it was usually sold very cheaply and to sort of more low income households, because they couldn't afford to buy some of the higher quality fish, or they couldn't, like, afford to buy a full fish or something. So then these sort of cut pieces of the rays were available more cheaply. to the point where I think it's like 600 rupees a kilo or something like that, which is very reasonable, to the point where that now they've developed a taste for rays. So you can slowly see fishers, instead of just having caught rays for gill plates, which is mostly for the export market, or as bycatch, which is what it used to be most prominently for the local market. Now actually they don't so much actively fish it, but there has developed a market for it, which is really scary, right?
Yeah.
Because you're having people do the research, you're having awareness come in, you have like knowledge generation on the fact that eating these species, because of the fact that they're so slow growing, is actually
And
so detrimental to the
threatening
environmental.
species.
Yeah, almost all of them are so endangered. But then you still have this uptake of the species taking place.
Yeah. But yeah, and also I think when it comes to the lack of awareness, I think we are responsible as well to ask questions when we go to restaurants or go to fish markets or even go to like anywhere you purchase, consume fish, to ask what these species are or like where it's coming from and things like that. So I think you all have also, the LEF has also worked on like a responsible seafood guide, which is very beneficial for even like chefs who are working in big restaurants or big hotels, to know what fish to buy and what not to buy.
Yeah.
But yeah.
Yeah, the guide's a fun one. It's actually, so we created it at Lanka Environment Fund because we also felt that there was just not enough information for consumers, and like it's very easy when you look abroad and someone tells you that you should eat sustainable fish, because when they go to their supermarkets and they look at the fish, it's labeled or it's certified, or there is like they have apps where you can scan it and it tells you like red, green, yellow. So there is so much information that's available for them to make these informed choices. But when you come to Sri Lanka, because a lot of our fisheries sector is mostly informal workers, and there is like no sort of mechanism that's telling you where your fish is from, or like, you know, who it has come from, where it has come from, and like the regulations are so sort of sparse. And even when regulations exist, that doesn't necessarily mean that there's enforcement. So it's like, how do you encourage better consumerism in a space like this, right? So I think what we really try to do with the guide is, instead of like, you know, telling people don't eat fish, which is very unrealistic in a country like Sri Lanka,
surrounded by the ocean.
Yeah, surrounded by the ocean, and some place where like fish is sort of a lifeblood. Like it's more than 50% of our daily protein as Sri Lankans, and they also like, it's a cultural thing, it's a livelihood thing, it's really built into the country. So that's very unrealistic in my opinion. But what we try to do with the guide is we try to encourage people to be a little bit more conscious as to how they are purchasing seafood. So it's not specifically for sharks, but basically it builds onto the same principle, where the first part of the guide asks you to follow a 4-step framework, of which the first step is, like you said, ask questions. So it's like, where did you come from? How was it fished? When was it fished? And then it's realizing that if people can't answer these questions, you should not buy from them, because what that then encourages is, the more you ask people these questions, the more they realize that there's an interest in the topic, and then they try to find the answers for it, which builds in traceability solutions. So then you over time will know where the fish is coming from, and then what you do is you keep going to people that can answer these questions, and you create that loyalty with the seller as well, which then encourages more people to adopt the same practice, because they want that kind of loyal customer base, right? But on sharks, basically all we've encouraged in the guide is encourage people not to eat sharks or rays,
because they're actually endangered
because
species.
they're so endangered. And the thing
some
is,
of them are illegal to fish.
I think we have five shark species that are illegal in the country. But I guess in the guide, the reason we tell people not to eat it is also recognizing that there are other species that could fill in the gap of the shark. It's not like we have a taste for shark, right? You're not like, oh my god, Moramalu is my favorite. Like you don't even sometimes know which fish you're eating. So which means it's so easy to substitute it for another species that's probably less endangered or less threatened, or like more easier to recover from high fishing pressure, right?
I think it would be interesting to even hear the guest perspective on this as well, because They, I think, do a lot of research on this subject, and yeah.
Yeah, I think they've done data collection over the last many years, I think about over 10 years. So just hearing what they have to say, I think would be super interesting.
Yeah.
Have you ever loved something so much you wanted to wear it? Tapro Treasures is Sri Lanka's first dive and ocean brand that focuses on spreading love to life beneath our blue waves.
Today we have joining us Daniel Fernando. He's the director and co-founder of Blue Resources Trust. Thank you so much for joining us on the podcast today.
Yeah, I think we've tried to get you for some time, and thank you for finally having the time to do this. So we just want to figure out how you started your journey and what made you want to study elasmobranch in in your field.
Sure, that's a good question, and thank you first of all for having me here as well. I think I always had an interest for the oceans, but I never really got the opportunity to study it. So my undergraduate degree was actually in biomedical science, and I was studying rheumatoid arthritis. So something quite different. But then I got the opportunity to go scuba diving in the Maldives, and that of course reignited my passion for the ocean. And it just got me a lot more focused on trying to figure out ways to do something related to the ocean. And then I really got a breakthrough with my master's, which was an opportunity I got to go to the UK and study marine resources management. So while it wasn't strictly marine biology, it was at least, sort of in the similar field. And as it so happens with the work that I do, it's quite relevant actually. Yeah. And that's pretty much how I started out sort of in the general marine field. As for sharks and rays, honestly, just being in the right place at the right time. It was a lot of luck, a lot of interactions with the right people. But I think most importantly, and this is something I tell a lot of people, is that whenever you get opportunities, it's up to you to make the most of it. And I'd like to think that I did at that point, and that's how I ended up studying sharks and rays.
So like you're saying, you study elasmobranches, right, as they are more commonly known. So for our audience today, could you tell us a little bit about what elasmobranches are, what makes them special, sort of why they're even put into one category like this, and sort of your experience working with them?
Yeah, so elasmobranchs is the collective name for both sharks and rays, and this group of fish are characterized by a few key features. One of them is that they all have cartilaginous skeletal structures, so not bones like what we have, but more like what we have in our nose and our ears. And this allows them to be incredibly flexible in the ocean, and also to be able to live throughout the water column, going to depths of several thousand meters all the way into very shallow waters. And as you might have heard, some species that even manage to get out of the water and walk briefly on land, the walking sharks. So that's what really defines this particular group. And when you look between the sharks and the rays, I like to say that the simplest way to define a ray is basically if you take a shark and you run a steamroller over it and you get it nice and flat, that's what a ray is. So they're very closely related, pretty much, same biological traits. And I think what's really special about this group of animals is the diversity. Globally there are over 1,200 species of shark and ray. In Sri Lanka we have at least about 105 different species of shark and ray. And unfortunately these species are highly threatened. So that's why a lot of people are trying to work to better understand them, but also to better manage and protect them.
Talking about them being threatened, so through your work you do a long-term fisheries monitoring project. Tell us a bit about it and how long y'all have been doing it for.
So I initially started out by studying manta and mobile rays, and that's what I did back, I think I started around 2010. And a few years later, I got the opportunity to go for a regional red list assessment workshop. And as part of that workshop, what we basically realized was there was no other information available from Sri Lanka for all sharks and rays, not just the manta and mobile rays. So at that point, I decided when I was coming back to basically expand the work from manta and mobulas to cover all sharks and rays. And that, I would say, really expanded in around sort of 2016, 2017. So we have almost a 10-year data set covering all sharks and rays, and the manta and mobula data set goes back to about 2010. But at the moment, we have the largest systematic data collection for sharks and rays in Sri Lanka, and probably one of the largest data sets for the region as well.
That's really good. Can you tell us a little bit about what you actually do in this long-term monitoring project, like what it entails, and like what you use the data for as well?
Yeah, so, well, first of all, I should say that there's a big team working with me. I used to spend a lot of time in the field, mostly when it was manta and mobula rays, and since then, I have an amazing team of researchers that go out and collect a lot of the data. So a typical day for them would involve usually getting up fairly early. It depends on the landing site. For example, at Negombo, you need to be there around 4 in the morning. Most of the landing sites somewhere between 6 to 7 a.m. And they'll spend a couple of hours collecting the data. So basically any shark or ray that is landed, they try and collect as much biological information as possible. So first of all, what the species is, collecting a few good photographs that we can use for additional identification afterwards, collecting tissue samples that we use for genetics or stable isotope analysis, and then a whole lot of other parameters, typical stuff like the size of the individual, whether it's a male or female, sexual maturity, and so on. And through all of this data, and by sort of having this long-term temporal data set, we are able to evaluate changes. So whether it's reductions in a particular species or occasionally increases in a particular species, and then we of course try and correlate that with fishing effort and a lot of other parameters to ensure that the data is actually representing what's happening with the populations out there. So that's a sort of brief overview of the data we collect. As for what we do with the data, it's a lot more complicated, but essentially we try and use this data to try and inform better management. This is done both at a national level, where we work closely with the Fisheries Department, providing technical advice where possible, also with the Department of Wildlife Conservation, and then also internationally through various mechanisms. For example, you have the Indian Ocean Tuna Commission, or IOTC, which covers, the Indian Ocean region, of course, and then a few international conventions like CITES, which is a Convention on International Trade, and CMS, the Convention on Migratory Species. So through all of these forums, we tend to provide a lot of technical advice. Oh, and then of course, also the IUCN Red List assessments, which is quite important to get an idea or a better understanding of how species are doing both regionally and globally as well.
So Sri Lanka has historically been a nation that has high shark landing, right? And even now, I think almost everyone has probably eaten shark, whether they know it or not. So based on the data and the studies you've done for now, what would you be able to tell us about the shark and ray populations in our waters?
Well, very simply, they're in big trouble. When we look at it, the shark and ray fisheries in Sri Lanka probably started in the late 50s, more like in the 60s and 70s. And a lot of that was being driven by, I think, international organizations who were trying to support, at that time, what they considered potentially sustainable fisheries for different species groups. So they invested a lot of time and money into encouraging shark and ray fisheries, not just in Sri Lanka, but across the region. And that's how many of these countries started targeting sharks and rays specifically. And then we saw shifts sort of in the 90s and the 2000s, where data started emerging that sharks and rays aren't actually a species that should be fished commercially. There were lots of issues at that time around finning of sharks, which was the practice of cutting the fins and then just tossing the carcass overboard. And so then you started seeing a slight shift where countries started focusing again a bit more on tuna fisheries. And officially, Sri Lanka claims that in 2000, we transitioned from a shark fishery back to a tuna fishery. As for what that transition actually entailed, apart from stating that it was a transition, is still quite unclear, because we didn't really or we were not able to document any change in fishing techniques or the type of fishing gears being used. So it's very unclear what actually changed. And unfortunately, a lot of the data that was being collected by the government at that time was not of high quality. So you can't really use that to determine that there was a true shift in the fisheries. But all of this fishing pressure across the region, considering that many of these species are migratory, get affected by multiple countries, has meant that their populations have severely declined. And we're talking of, for certain species, population declines of about 90% in some cases, often over very short time periods. So yeah, it's not a great situation that these species are in.
Speaking of sharks, and like we are known, like we obviously know that they're apex predators and they are very high on the food chain. What like obviously from the research that you all have done and the surveys that you all have been doing, I mean, obviously if you go to a fish market, like probably to Nigamba fish market or like one of the biggest fish markets, you will always see sharks actually being fished out. And most of them are endangered species like hammerheads and thresher sharks, and you'll see so many fins. Do you think that Sri Lanka has enough awareness about the situation, like the fact that these species are actually being fished out and we don't really have them in the sea anymore, but at fishing markets?
Not at all. Honestly, I don't think the majority of people are aware of the severity of the situation. As you pointed out, I think our data shows that over 70% of the species landed in Sri Lanka are considered threatened with extinction. A lot of the species are more threatened or more vulnerable than our leopards and elephants. We have documented the first extirpations, so local extinctions of a group of species called the sawfishes. So these species were quite abundant, or at least relatively frequently encountered at fishery landing sites in the early 1990s. It was quite interesting. We actually did a local ecological knowledge survey where we interviewed fishers of different age groups. And basically, if you showed a fisher, now our study was a few years ago, so probably a fisher over the age of about 60 or 65, if you showed them a picture of a sawfish, they knew exactly what it was, and they had probably seen one at some point during their lifetime, usually, of course, dead at a landing site. You show it to anybody under the age of 50, they had no idea what it was. So this clearly documented that in the 1990s, these species were relatively frequently encountered. There were lots of other sources of evidence as well. For example, the sawfishes have this very unique rostrum on the top of their heads, and those were often donated to churches and all that. So you can still find them sometimes in a few of the coastal churches around the country. So these species were there. The last confirmed record we have is of a single specimen from 2018. And previously, I think over the last sort of 10, 15 years before that, there were probably less than 10 records at most, more likely just about 4 or 5 records. So it's clear evidence that a species has almost been completely wiped out from our waters, most certainly functionally extinct, potentially also completely extinct from our waters. And it's really an indicator of where we are headed with a lot of these other species. And unfortunately, the level of awareness, particularly among fishery managers and all that, is insufficient, and they don't often consider the science we have done sufficient to act on it. They say that the data has to originate from government sources, and unfortunately that's often lacking in our case. So yeah, it's not a great situation, but something that's also quite interesting when we're talking about knowledge is if you speak to shark fin traders and all that, it's quite scary when you talk to them because they have seen the declines during their lifetime. Some of the fin traders have told me that it takes them about a week to collect the number of fins that they would collect in a day, again around the 90s or when they used to go with their father or whatever to the landing site to collect fins. Quite a lot of the fin traders have said they're trying to make as much money as they can to ensure that they can give their children a good education so that they do not end up doing the same thing because they guarantee that there won't be sharks at fishery landing sites in Sri Lanka in the near future. So when you have this from the traders whose livelihoods are directly affected by this, it's something that we should really be concerned about, but unfortunately not enough people are.
That sounds so bleak.
Yeah,
I guess
It was like a horror movie.
I guess also just thinking about what you were saying about like the lack of awareness. One thing I was also thinking is that because sharks are so like diverse, like I feel like people don't even realize that they're eating shark, or like, you know what, all of the different species that they are having is shark, and like, you know, even sometimes caravala will be shark, or like, you know, they'll eat a ray without an actual understanding of what they're eating. And I think everyone's perception when they think shark is to think of like, you know, something like a great white or a bull shark, and immediately they'll be like, yeah, we don't eat that, but then they're still eating shark. So, and I think something that's a little bit more of a complicating factor in Sri Lanka would be the sort of people's purchasing power and sort of economic status, right? Because at the end of the day, like a lot of the times, if shark is what's available to eat and if it's affordable for people, like especially in places like the Negombo fish market where, you know, everything sells, like how do you really encourage or like enforce regulations to prevent eating shark? I don't know if that's even an answer you would have, but it's definitely something I've observed.
Yeah, I think that's the issue that you raised is the biggest challenge that we're faced with. And as you pointed out, I don't have an answer. If I did, these species would probably be fine. There isn't an answer that's going to keep everybody happy, let's put it that way. Fisher livelihoods will definitely get affected. They're going to get affected one way or another. Either the species are going to go extinct and they're going to permanently lose their livelihoods, or we have to severely cut back at this point in time. And it's not something that's easy to do. But we also have to keep in mind that our fishing industry is quite diverse and quite large in Sri Lanka. So we have about 50,000 fishing vessels operating, of which a significant proportion are also, even though by Sri Lankan standards we classify them as small-scale artisanal, it's very much a large-scale artisanal fishing effort that's taking place. And a lot of these are more similar to commercial fishing activities. You have, you know, mudalalis who own multiple fishing vessels. They're not doing it for subsistence purposes. It's revenue generating. It's a money-making industry. And I think there's a difference between those type of fisheries and then the very small-scale subsistence fisheries, or those that truly rely on it from a livelihood perspective. And I think we need to look at certain species like sharks and rays, and we need to say, okay, these species cannot be commercially harvested anymore. You cannot be catching them at very large amounts, especially if it's going into international trade. You need to look at ensuring that if these species are being captured, they're only being captured by people who actually really need it for their food security and or their livelihoods. And it's a very difficult conversation to have, but sometimes you need to look at it from a different perspective. If you look at something similar on land, now we're talking of sharks and rays, many of them, if you take the manta ray as an example, it gives birth to one single pup every 3 to 6 years. It takes 15 years to mature, and it can live for at least about 60 to 80 years. It has a slower life cycle than an elephant does, and yet it receives absolutely no protection. Do we have the same concerns about people who are killing elephants or people who are poaching leopards? Right? Somebody who's poaching a leopard, they're not doing it because they enjoy it. They're doing it also for their livelihood, to bring money, to ensure that they have food on the table. And it's the same with the fishers that are going out. They're doing this to ensure that they have livelihoods. But unfortunately, some species simply cannot be commercially harvested. And we've made those decisions with species like leopards and elephants, and we need to do the same with many species like sharks and rays.
I think we always make a comparison to sort of terrestrial species in a lot of aspects that we talk about here. And I guess just the visibility that terrestrial species have gives them so much.
And the accessibility as well.
Accessibility.
The fact that you can go to a park and see a leopard or an elephant, and compared to using a shark, it's honestly so rare to find a shark here while diving or snorkeling. except for in the east at Pigeon Island. So obviously when you're seeing it, you will realize that
you don't associate it as like a
Exactly.
charismatic animal in the same. Actually, that's very interesting because I also remember when I was studying, we like realized one thing is that like fish, or like in this case sharks, they don't even qualify as wildlife in the same way, right? Like when you think fish, you ultimately think of them as a food resource,
Yeah.
and how that also then builds into how you are protecting them or how you are policing and regulating things. So that, I mean, I guess goes to your point as to why they are not protected in the same way.
Yeah, and fish is quite interesting because if you look at it, from Sri Lanka, if you look at a poi a day, you can't buy meat, but you can buy fish. It's not even considered an animal almost for Buddhists, which is super interesting. But I think it's these different perceptions that people have of wildlife that's really the issue. But we have seen these shifts now. If you look again a couple of decades back, we were actively fishing turtles, we were actively fishing, dolphins and all of that. And those mindsets have changed. So I think it's not too different when it comes to species like this. We just have to recognize that they are different. They're not like every other fish in the ocean. But yeah, I mean, all of the points you raised are incredibly valid. It's a lot easier to see what's happening on land, and this is the same issue that we have from a scientific perspective as well, collecting data. We do it through fishery landing sites because it's almost impossible to go out to sea and try and figure out how many sharks and rays there are.
Yeah.
As you point out, Pigeon Island is one of the only places you're guaranteed to see a shark alive in our waters, even though we have 105 species, and if you put out a fishing net, there's a very high chance you'll capture one. So, yeah.
Talking about sharks and rays and not having them in the water, you are actually hosting one of the biggest international shark conferences in Sri Lanka for the first time in Asia actually. Right?
Yeah.
Tell us a bit about the conference and what the audience can learn or at least help in any way.
So yeah, it's called Sharks International, and it's the world's largest scientific and policy conference focusing specifically for sharks, rays, and also chimeras, which are the ghost sharks. It takes place once every 4 years, and this is the first time it's being held in Asia, and we're fortunate to have it here in Colombo in Sri Lanka. We'll be hosting it at BMICH. It's one of the few venues that's actually large enough because we're expecting about 600 to 800 participants. As of today morning, we have about 720 registered attendees, so
Wow.
we're leaning more towards the 800 at the moment. But it's a great opportunity, not just for those in Sri Lanka, but for many of the researchers, scientists, funders, policymakers from the general South Asia region and probably wider as well. Simply because a lot of the previous times the conference has been hosted in places where visa accessibility has been incredibly challenging. And then of course the costs for attending conferences are usually a big problem. So when it moves around internationally, it makes it a bit easier for people to access. But yeah, we're just hoping to have a more diverse and inclusive conference than some of the previous iterations have been, and yeah, compared to many other international conferences as well. We're trying to do a lot of fundraising because unfortunately, unlike some better established conferences that have a secretariat which just gives you a lump of money and you can run with it, we got zero to start off with. So we had to fundraise, and our intention was to try and ensure that things like registration fees are as subsidized as possible. So for Sri Lankan students, if I'm not mistaken, the registration fee is about $75, which for a 5-day international conference is a very good deal because it would typically be in the range of anywhere from $200 to about $400 for such a conference. So yeah, we've tried to make it as accessible as possible, and we really hope that a lot of Sri Lankans, but also other South Asians will attend the conference.
I mean, it's so cool because like we've never attended like an international conference of such a standing because it just hasn't existed in spaces that were accessible to us. So it's really cool and nice to see that in sort of the conservation space, the question of access and sort of equity and all of that is also coming into the space. So just thinking out loud, this might be a bit of a complex question, but sort of looking at Sri Lanka's relationship with shark fisheries and the fact that, it's not the best, like what does hosting a global gathering that's focused on shark conservation look like in this aspect?
That's a good question. I mean, Sri Lanka is definitely one of the larger shark fisheries globally, and when you look at certain species like manta and mobula rays, we're probably in the top 3, if not the top 5 fisheries. Having said that, we are of course not the only fisheries for sharks and rays that take place, much of it across the tropical belt, but you also have a few developed countries, and I think often when we think of shark and ray fisheries, we immediately get drawn to, okay, it's an East Asian problem, but some of the larger fisheries in the world are actually European fleets that are fishing many of these species. And then, of course, we have countries in South Asia, ourselves included, that are one of the biggest culprits. But I think by bringing conferences like this to countries like Sri Lanka, it also helps highlight that there is a lot of data collection occurring in the country itself, but hopefully it also provides opportunities for government officers to easily access meetings such as this. We've seen a lot of government officers already registering from our neighboring countries, so we hope that a few more Sri Lankan government officers will attend as well. Because it will give them opportunities to hear from a lot of international scientists whom one normally doesn't have access to, and recognize that while we are facing significant challenges here, our issues or challenges are not unique. Many other countries are facing similar issues, and we can learn from them as well. That's not to say that because other countries are doing the same, we can just ignore it and say, okay, other countries are also impacting these species, so it's not a problem we need to be concerned about. It's most certainly something that we have to play an active role in. But I really hope that it also provides an opportunity for Sri Lankan researchers to both establish new collaborations, but also find opportunities for funding to be able to drive more work in the country itself, and hopefully encourage better, more proactive management to take place.
I mean, I think there has been some progress or like positive influence, right? Because I recently discovered that there are also certain species of sharks, the thresher sharks specifically, that's actually illegal to be caught. Do you want to tell us a little bit more about that?
Yeah, I mean, it's positive, but not enough progress. So we have 105 species, out of which 5 are protected. We have the 3 thresher sharks, the oceanic white-tipped shark, and the whale sharks. And while it's great that Sri Lanka have protected them, unfortunately none of those protections were as a result of national proactive management. It was all through regional mechanisms that required Sri Lanka to protect these species. So these 5 species were protected under our obligations under the IOTC, the Indian Ocean Tuna Commission. So it's good to see some of these actions being implemented at a national level, but what we are really lacking is more proactive management, taking into consideration species that we have within Sri Lankan waters. So we have some species that are, at least, let's say, endemic between India and Sri Lanka, and many of these species fall outside the mandates of bodies like IOTC or CITES or CMS, and we really need to take national initiative to better manage them, and that's something that's really lacking, unfortunately. And as I pointed out earlier, we have 105 species, out of which over 70% are threatened with extinction. So we should actually be protecting at least about 70 of these species, and we have only 5 protected at the moment. And we don't, I should be careful. We have a lack of interest from the government to even proactively protect species that are considered almost extinct from our waters, like the sawfishes.
Yeah. Well, this is very interesting. And before we end, we'd like to ask you one question. What would you leave with, and what is something that you would give as advice to someone who wants to get into this field, or who wants to learn more about sharks and rays, or even just bring more awareness about the situation in Sri Lanka?
Well, firstly, I would say register and join the conference, because that will be a great opportunity. I mean, this meeting, first of all, happens once every 4 years, and most of the time it's at the other end of the world where it's just exorbitant to get to, or visa accessibility is a big issue. You'd be able to interact with so many scientists who are, global specialists in this. And of course, a lot of Sri Lankan marine biologists who have been doing a lot of work and have a lot of knowledge and expertise. So if you have an interest or passion in this field, these are the sort of opportunities one should take advantage of and make the most out of. And if one is interested in the field, reach out to organizations that do work like this. There are many Sri Lankan marine organizations who would be happy to get additional support. One thing to highlight, of course, is that it's not easy. It's something one should be passionate in. If you're looking to make money and get rich, find something else. This is not the field for you. You have to really want to do something. You really need, and I mean, this is the case for pretty much all conservation work, really. What were your other aspects? Sorry.
Bringing awareness.
Bringing awareness, yeah. Well, it's challenging. I mean, one thing, of course, is to spread the message, get as many people aware of the issues that we are faced with. But I think as individuals, making more conscious decisions about certain actions that we take, and I mean, it's really great to see the work that LEF and others have been doing with the Sustainable Seafood Guide, because that's something I've always been saying is one of the first steps that people need to do. It's not easy to just say eat sustainable seafood. You need to know what is sustainable, and the first thing that I always encourage people to do is ask questions. Anytime you go to a restaurant or somewhere where you're purchasing seafood, ask what the species is, where it has come from, is it sustainable? I can guarantee you that they won't be able to answer at least 2 out of 3 of those questions. But the more times we ask these questions, at some point they will feel obligated to try and get some of this information. This is how it's happened in other countries. It hasn't just overnight appeared in place. People have started having these discussions and asking these questions. So I think encouraging that movement to take place is quite critical, because that then in turn helps drive national regulations that get put into place, requiring seafood to be properly labeled, encouraging initiatives for sustainable seafood options, and all of that is what's really going to drive change. But we need to recognize that all of us as individuals, our drive to consume a lot and to consume cheaply is what's resulting in a lot of these species extinctions, basically.
I think that was really, really good advice, because I was also just thinking when you ask those questions, you're also incentivizing people to start creating traceability solutions, right? Which then helps know where your fish is coming from, what you're eating, how it was fished, and things like that, which in turn, like you said, can help regulations. And just so that it's not all doom and gloom, we've had a lot of very heavy topics today. Can you tell us, just to end a little bit on a positive note, maybe a fun fact about a shark, or what you find so cool about them, or your favorite shark, or just anything a little lighter?
Sure. I mean, I would say, my favorite rays actually are probably the manta rays, just because they're such amazing, and I mean, they are charismatic species, but it's one of the largest fish in the ocean, and when you encounter this amazing animal just swimming towards you, you just can't help but be amazed about what's actually out there. But looking at the shark and ray diversity as a whole, I mean, it's just incredible. Even in Sri Lanka, the diversity that we have, from electric rays to butterfly rays and all the different sharks that we have. It's just incredible biodiversity that we have at our doorstep. And I think getting more people to appreciate that would that would be really nice.
Mm-hmm. I think we can end on that. Thank you so much, everybody, for listening, and thank you again, Daniel, for coming on board and sharing with us everything that you had to share. It was, I think, really
knowledgeable,
very enlightening, and I definitely know I won't be eating shark anytime soon. Thank you for listening,
and see you on the next one. This podcast is a CreatorCast production.